Good morning, people of the internet. You're listening to Debi Radio 79.5 FM, a podcast where we discuss the movie Grosse Pointe Blank 1 minute at a time. Only now for a few more minutes. I am your co-host, Hugh David.
And I'm your other co-host, Dev Sodiger, and on today's show, we're going to be looking at minute 106 in the latter part of the end credits roll.
Joining us on today's show and for the remaining shows on this movie, we have the return of our lovely guests, Richard Cottrell and Graham Smith. Welcome back, gentlemen.
Hi.
Nice to be back.
Fantastic.
And it is our penultimate episode. We have one more after this. We're going to overrun a little bit on tomorrow's episode with a slightly longer than a minute segment of the film. But the end is in sight. It has been a long road to get here.
Your magnum opus is almost finished.
I know. I mean, I'm not sure it's the greatest thing to leave in posterity, but I've had fun doing it, so it was totally worth it.
Yeah, I think considering the lack of a decent special edition, this will stand for posterity.
Yeah, and speaking of that lack of special edition, we were discussing a few weeks ago now, but the kind of the difficulty with coordinating rights in for releasing movies with all the various parties involved. And for some reason, I thought almost all of the music in this was actually Sony music, and it really isn't. I mean, there is a chunk of Sony music, but then you've got Polygram, MCA, like a bunch of others, BIS, Virgin Records, and we get to see all of them or a good number of them in this minute as well.
Very much so. I mean, this is exactly the thing I was saying about possible reasons why it's getting, even with streaming rights and even with Disney cutting the Gordian knot, it may still be an issue to get it out on disc, That's a mess of rights right there. And it would also explain why CDs don't get reissued, The 90s was an interesting time for soundtracks and music generally. I mean, it's at that point we're about 15 years into the trend of using pop music as the soundtrack with a score, it's a little dropped in here and there in between, but the tendency of the public to remember the songs rather than the score. And we're now fully into that era of 2 albums per film, 1 score album, 1 songs album. And quite often the songs even include songs that aren't in the film, inspired by the film. And it's big business. It's big business, So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that a film where music was as important as this one, and where Cusack made such an effort to get things he loved in on the soundtrack. It doesn't surprise me now. But it does explain. It goes some way towards explaining the continued difficulties in seeing it in the home video market.
Yeah. And actually, speaking of the work on that, it's interesting that we also see in this minute that the musical consultants include D.V. DeVincentis, who was one of the guys who was involved in the rewrite, and I don't think he does cameo in the film, does he?
I think he does somewhere. I think I'm pretty sure all of them at some point or another turn up, just maybe in really tiny roles in some cases.
I'm gonna have to try and look this up.
There'll be a lot of that in these episodes.
It does feel like the sort of thing that there's enough scenes of groups of people in the background where you could quite easily slip people in.
Yeah,
Yes.
Actually, he even has lines in this film. He plays Dan Goretzky, who we talked about a little while ago during the high school reunion. He is the computer geek that Bob DiStefano calls out. So he does have a brief moment, and actually is one of those characters I kind of wish was a little bit more prominent, kind of like Tracy. I wish there had been a few more scenes with them to kind of establish that there was actually like something for Martin to come home to, right? They both come off as folks that were pretty friendly in high school, beyond just Paul and Debbie. So we also have this week returning guests, Graham and Richard, who previously was subject to my little guinea pig experiment of only watching a small chunk of the movie. they got set extra homework after that week of recording to go away and watch the whole movie this time and come back with their thoughts. So, Graham, what did you think of the film?
I thought it was interesting. So, I mean, the first thing that I found interesting was I was talking to some of our mutual friends, friends of yours from school who you introduced me to after university where we met. And I was like, oh, yeah, Grosse Pointe Blank. And they were all like, wait, Dev forced me to watch that. All of them, absolutely universal, were like, yeah, Dev forced me to watch that. One of them did confess they had watched it again without your prompting. But, all of their first experience was due to you. And obviously,
this is why I was honestly gobsmacked that neither of you two had seen this film, because it is literally the film that I make everybody watch. If I know anybody for any length of time, they get made to watch this film. Half my Derby team have now seen this film, and I've only known them for less than a year.
Is it going to come out at the end of this that you're getting kickbacks on DVD sales or something?
I wish. I mean, I'd be paying myself decent money the number of copies that I've bought for myself over the years.
Yeah, true that.
So yeah, no, I ended up sat down and watched it, and I thought it was an interesting. Like during our earlier discussions, it was described as a mashup of kind of a rom-com and an action flick, and I think what I particularly enjoyed is some of the subversion of the rom-com tropes. Like, you get that moment where they finally meet face to face and there's the pause and you're like, oh, this is going to kick off the whole long, slow burn romance. No, they're kissing already.
Yeah.
Like, kind of completely threw that out the window. And then I also think...
An interesting moment there because Hugh and I were discussing this just yesterday. And it turns out that was actually off script. It was done impromptu by Minnie Driver seemingly without even John Cusack knowing it was going to happen. So the reaction from John Cusack there is real in that moment.
No, I particularly enjoyed that as a subversion of the trope. Beforehand. And then, you've then got like the action weaves in pretty well, I feel, at various points. No, I enjoyed it as a film. I mean, it's not going to enter, the pantheon of one of my greatest films of all time, but it was fun. You're trying not to look too offended at that, Dev.
I mean, I'm a biased actor in this one, right? Like this is.
I'm sorry, Lucky Number 11 keeps its top spot.
It's a good film, that. Good film.
Yep. Fair enough. Yeah.
And
okay. Now that you've mentioned that, I see. Yeah, I might have to go and rewatch that now.
Yeah, Slevin. Not only is that a good film, but it also has a surprising amount in common with this film.
Hilariously, the first time I saw Lucky Number 11 was on a flight, there was an issue with the software that they were using, so that you couldn't start your own thing. This was when this was a fairly new technology. So I jumped into the film 5 minutes late.
Oh, no.
I missed the first 5 minutes, which I think made the film better.
You know what? That is a thing about certain films, right? There's this need, but particularly by producers, to make sure that everything is told to the audience at the start, like a headline, like a new piece of newspaper, right? And the reality is, a good film doesn't need that.
Yeah,
because I remember my friend going to see Dark City in the cinema, and having to race up the motorway from south of Surrey from Hawley. We were driving up to Croydon to see it, and we got stuck in traffic, and we were late, and we came crashing through. We bought the tickets, ran upstairs, got in. And we got in at the point where, again, 5 minutes in, so basically the story starts. Now, I wouldn't realise until the DVD, which was years later, that there's a whole voiceover at the beginning that tells you everything, which is terrible, and they took out in the director's cut. But my friend Andy and I were just, this film's amazing. This is such a great film. Why is everyone complaining about it? And then, years later, we were like, oh.
Thankfully, like with Slevin, because I've done, a bit like Dev with this film, apart from to me, apparently, I've shown a lot of people Lucky Number 11.
Yeah.
And the opening section, which I think kind of spoils or like heavily hints at one of the twists.
Yeah.
None of them picked up on it. Absolutely.
Oh, really?
None of them. Okay. So I suspect it was more when I was watching it with, full knowledge of the film, I'm like, they just gave away this moment. And that actually brings me back to another thing about Grosse Pointe Blank, when we were talking, we mentioned the "it's not me" line that gets repeated, because the scene we came in on, he just stabbed someone to death, with a pen, and he said, "It's not me." And I'm not sure I would have picked up on that as a reoccurring line throughout the film unless we'd had that discussion. So, like, when I was watching it, every time he mentioned it, I was like, "Oh yeah, there it is again, there it is again." And as I say, I'm not sure I would have picked up on it on a first view.
Yeah, I don't think I did on the first view. I think that's definitely something that came with later viewings. Very much so. But that's the joy of the film. They've packed so much in. Yeah. So overall, then, thumbs up, but no Hall of Famer.
No Hall of Famer. Sorry. Watch as I now get kicked off and erased from this episode. Dev just edits me out carefully.
It's allowed. I'll allow it.
Goes back and re-records the other episodes as well.
Reconsider our entire friendship going forwards. Yeah.
I mean, what about you, Richard? What did you feel about it?
I'm in a similar boat. It was better than I was expecting from the minutes we saw and what I'd seen about it previously, and my vague memories of other John Cusack films, which I think is just High Fidelity. I mean, High Fidelity, I seem to remember enjoying it at the time and thinking it was fine, but it's probably telling that I haven't rewatched it since whenever that was that I first watched it 16, 18 years ago. And this falls into the same category, I think, of I've enjoyed it, but I can't see me deliberately rewatching it at any point.
Fair enough.
There
were good. Yeah, there were plenty of good points to it, but it also feels not necessarily in the wheelhouse of what I'd normally go for, and probably not dated as such, but parts have been now done better since and moved on from.
Yeah, and I think that aligns with what Hugh, your partner, said when she watched it whilst we were going through this.
Yeah, felt exactly the same thing as you guys.
Yeah, it's a solid film, but dated at this point.
I think that's the thing that happens with sort of whenever you come to a film. I mean, my wife she finally watched Star Wars films. I mean, it was only about 5-6 years back for the whole lot of them, and it was a similar thing of the original films were good, but she was just seeing how much has done it since then better.
Yeah, that's Kim's experience is usually that. I mean, one of my usual comments now when I'm going to say, "Have you seen a film?" She says, "No." I say, "If we're going to watch it together, I always ask, tell me have you seen the Simpsons version of it? And if you have, fine, forget it. But you're not going to, that's it. It's ruined. Move on."
It's funny because, like, a bit like many years ago now, I read Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, and I spent the entire time reading that, being like, "Oh, this is the progenitor of this sci-fi trope, and this sci-fi trope, and this sci-fi trope." Yeah. And there were certain bits in this where I was like, "Oh, it feels like another film has taken inspiration." For example, the very final kind of action scene around the house reminded me a lot of Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah. There's definitely a thing about it's a very American thing. This idea of the suburban house, the home, right, and trashing the home using large artillery.
What was the Arnold Schwarzenegger film with the gun that had like the green scope that could see through stuff and
because that was around this time as well. It's the one with the railgun, isn't it?
Yeah, the railgun.
Eraser.
Something like that?
Yeah, Eraser. Yeah, because they just tried to make a TV pilot of that the other year, and apparently it was dire, but no surprise there. But Eraser was fun. I saw it in cinema.
Yeah, it was fun. It wasn't exactly what I would call a good film, but I just, sorry, as you were saying that, I have this memory of the scene where like Arnie arrives at the house carrying a bunch of balloons, and then the house promptly gets decimated in the following fight.
Yeah, it's a very American trope. I mean, Lethal Weapon's or one of the Lethal Weapons has it. At least one of them, maybe two. It's just this standard thing of saying, "Look, this is what everyone works for, but actually, this is what really happens to it." We destroy that.
That would work quite differently if you were to try and do that in the UK and just end up blasting through some terraced houses or whatever. I mean, that feels closer to The Raid or something.
Well, they did that in I mean, I felt like that with the recent run of Doctor Who specials. In the first one, where he figures out how to punch, create a barrier with all the bad guys shooting them, and then take the family up through the roofs and run through the terrace. The days of us doing those kind of action TV shows as well is pretty much long gone in Britain. I was thinking.
I mean, I kind of feel we get the gangster stuff instead. The Lock, Stock, the Layer Cake, things like that.
Well, we've just had The Gentleman now, haven't we? As well, that's turned into a TV show as well.
I haven't watched either The Gentleman or I mean to watch The Gentleman at some point, and I saw that Netflix is turning it into a TV show.
Yeah, I can honestly say the film is fantastic. Like, I was not expecting to enjoy it as much as I would. I thought, oh, it'll be all right. It's just Lock, Stock with a bigger budget, right? It's actually really good. It's really fun, right to the very last minute. I enjoyed it so much. I'm genuinely interested to see what the TV show does with it. So yeah, but yeah, no, it is a thing. We tend to have people threatening each other and shooting each other rather than destroying the scenery, because destroying the scenery is more expensive here. A couple of actors leaning on each other with knives is not a big deal.
It's much easier to go through drywall than it is to go through a prop wall.
Very true. That as well. Yeah, I could just imagine someone at this end yelling, "It's not protected. What's the word?
Listed."
Yeah, it's got listed status. Leave it alone.
It's a grade 2 listed building.
Yeah,
Stop.
Exactly. I'm pretty sure I heard about that as a story on one set where they were like, "You can't do that. Take that down now." Yeah. But no, I mean, America is it's a very different thing, and I am always fascinated when you see something blown up on screen, and if it's not well shot and edited, you can see that they built the thing onto something else, right? Like, there was no restaurant there, but they built a temporary structure there in order for the car to drive through it, or big, you know what I mean? It always fascinates me that.
Yep.
You see, I prefer it when they go the Jerry Anderson route and you kind of end up with a small model getting burned to pieces.
I love that. I miss the late great Derek Meddings. No one has done it as well since him. That last burst in GoldenEye when he gets with the aircraft flipping and crashing into the radar dish. That's literally the last thing he did before he died. That's one of the great pieces of model work. It looks so good even now. Yeah. And then it's all CG from then on, pretty much, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Certainly for the UK. I mean, here and there you'll get a director that gets nostalgic for models. I think some of the new Star Wars stuff is still being done with models.
That's all being done here, though, in the UK. So
it is, but it's on an American budget.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, but I mean, it's all those skills from earlier. I mean, just to come back for a moment, because this is you're making me think about something in the credits itself. So we're talking about models, we're talking about special effects. We are, the opening of this minute, it gives us the special effects people involved with the film, which is Ron Trost, Todd Masters, and Todd Masters' son, as well as makeup artist Cindy J. Williams. And it's really quite interesting because, first of all, I didn't realize how much I've seen of these people's work. Second of all, almost all of them at some point have gone on to win awards in their careers, like serious awards. In the case of Todd Masterson, he's got something like 16 awards under his belt from various special effects societies, and that's really quite something. But also, I'm looking at these films, and there's this interesting thing in the 90s which started in the 80s in American film, where people who worked in horror movies moved over to action thrillers. And there was a demand for injuries, blood bags, squibs, but of a more violent nature, right? Wounds had to look more gruesome, you know. And I'm thinking, for example, like Lethal Weapon 2, when the guy's head gets taken off by the surfboard at the end of the car chase, right? I can remember in the cinema the gasps as that happened, because it really is horror movie style, honk, and there's a visible chunk of neck left behind. And I seem to remember that Chuck Norris's Invasion USA famously had a ton of gore effects from Tom Savini, which were all cut out of the final cut, and no one's been able to find all the reels, so we'll never see. Not that I particularly want to see it, but it's that notion. It just fascinates me how horror and action collided, and therefore you get to Grosse Pointe Blank, and you guys came in with us on the pen stabbing scene. and that of course is exactly what these guys are good at and how they achieved it, and the level of graphic reality there. But of course, Grosse Pointe Blank is that different beast where you're not about horror effects, you're about realistic moments and realistic effects, and I find it interesting that they got such quality people on it. I mean, these guys were at what I would regard as the cutting edge of effects at the time, like Scream 2 and sorry, one of my all-time favorite movies, which has just been remastered, which is The Prophecy, which I absolutely adore. And also, some of these guys got careers that go back, all the way to Starman with John Carpenter in the 80s, and then they worked their way up through a bunch of stuff that most people probably won't know. Like, I love Extreme Justice SIS, which is this weird little cop film from '93, directed by the guy who directed Commando, and it's got an incredible cast. Right, it's got Yaphet Kotto and Lou Diamond Phillips and Scott Glenn. But the thing is, it's based on something that would only come to light in real life a few years later, which is a massive scandal to do with corrupt cops in Los Angeles, which has now been turned into the Shield TV show, and it's been turned into at least 3 films I can think of. But this film basically does it while the scandal's actually happening, because somebody knew somebody in LA and said, "Oh, by the way, have you heard about these cops who are basically a death squad?" And it's got these incredible shootouts, which are like blatantly unfair, where it's not like, oh look, the good guys are the bad guys. It's like the good guys are just mowing down people in the street, right? Like really gory and well done. But yeah, it's just interestingly weird to see these kind of connections,
Yep. The digital visual effects as well was done by CIS Hollywood, and that's this would have been one of the last projects that they worked on. But you've got some really, really like impressive things on that resume. The '89 Batman. You've got like Coneheads and Last Action Hero, which aren't super sci-fi, but they definitely have some good effects going on there. And then you've got things like Star Trek Generations, Waterworld, which, whilst maybe not commercially successful, have a lot of very
tons of effects. It's got loads of them.
And Eraser as well. Speaking of Eraser, so
well, because the entire everything to do with the railgun is just CG, right, basically in Eraser. It is interesting. The other thing that I think is interesting, given the time period, is we have credits for let me find it. There it is. The company E=MC², who I've seen a lot over the years in the credits, and their job specifically at this time is computer / 24 frame video effects. And I think modern audiences may not be aware of this, but there was a time period where, because you're shooting on film, computer screens, CRT screens, did not show up properly or clearly in the way you would like them to on film, because film was shot at 24 single photos per second that are then run at that speed, so it creates the illusion in your mind that you see movement. However, CRT doesn't work like that, and so you would end up with green lines running down, or you'd end up with flickering, and so you had people. It became a job to make sure that computer monitors looked steady on film. And of course, we've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about what's on those screens, but we actually have to credit a specific company and a couple of guys, people working with them. In this case, Robert Morgenroth, Robert Sharman, Steve Davis, as the people behind that, which is absolutely fascinating that we can actually pinpoint, all the way down to this exact set of people who did the job of making this look real.
It's something I must say I'd never considered. Like, I'm aware that CRTs look weird and so on. It's one of the issues of photographing at a high shutter speed, that you can end up with a weird effect on a screen, especially one that scans like the CRT does. And I'd never stopped to consider that obviously someone's got to make sure it works in old films.
So I remember playing around back when I think it was back when I first got digital camera, and just seeing all the settings of it, pointed at a TV with I think it was fairly short exposure, but not that short, and moved the camera as I took the picture, and you could see the individual frames across the image that was taken then.
It is so weird, isn't it, to think back to those days.
we see a ton of names here. I think we've kind of called out a bunch of them. The only other ones that I wanted to call out were the location managers.
Okay.
We have Ralph Coleman as the main location manager, and I think that's obviously a pretty tough job to give a Detroit vibe when shooting almost exclusively in LA. And I think it's pretty well done. It gives a decent vibe. Complete bias having not actually really been to Detroit, but certainly seeing a decent chunk of the Midwest and feeling like never having any sense that this wasn't actually filmed on location. I thought that was it was well done. We've kind of talked about it in past episodes, but wanted to give Ralph Coleman a shout out as someone who's worked on a lot of projects as well. Especially around this time, was working on Sex and the City for locations in LA, The Kid, Bicentennial Man, Inspector Gadget, As Good as It Gets, which I'm assuming there may have been some locations shot in LA to look like New York for that one.
Almost certainly.
Which I don't recall noticing from watching that film, although I've not seen it in a while, but that's quite a challenge because those are two very different looking cities.
Well, I mean, it was standard for TV shows back then to do that. I mean, both ER, which was in Chicago, technically set in Chicago, and NYPD Blue, which was technically set in New York, both shot in LA, and then they would fly out to their respective cities to do a whole bunch of pickups.
Yeah,
which they would then edit back into the various episodes from throughout the series. But it always bugged me with the NYPD Blue, because despite the fact they won an Emmy for the way they built for the set that was the precinct house that was obviously built in LA and used in LA, but it looked realistic enough that it won awards. Once they stepped outdoors and the attempt to make certain hole in the wall bars look like they were in New York, it just didn't work.
yeah.
There is something about the light in Los Angeles, particularly when captured on film, that is just so different from New York.
It's just too clean. It's too clean, too bright.
Yeah, absolutely. And they tried their best, but filters and jerky camera work never quite did it for me. But kudos to them for keeping the show going for 12 years with that. And the ER as well. They did the same thing with Chicago, and they managed to pull that off for 15 years.
So, and it to be fair, it is a lot harder to pull off on a TV show where you're like, there are only so many clear sunny days you're going to get in New York or in Chicago, exactly. Right? Like, for a film, you can kind of get away with it as a few clear days, and it's.
Well, the irony is, of course, is that this is at the same time that NYPD Blue debuts, Law and Order debuts, and that transforms the New York film economy.
Right.
Once Dick Wolf starts adding more shows, you start to get 3 shows. They're all shot there. They all use New York for real. They make it work, come rain or shine, and suddenly the difference is really palpable. You will watch this one show and go, "Oh, that's really where it's supposed to be," which I found very entertaining. And then the other thing that I find interesting about America is, of course, tax breaks. So many films and TV shows are shot somewhere that is not where the location in the script is, just because they're saving money.
Yeah, I mean, the number of TV shows in Toronto in the 90s because Canada was offering the bigger tax breaks.
Canada has basically doubled as the rest of the universe for quite some time now.
Yeah, and frequently other American cities as well.
Oh, yeah. Toronto is just everywhere else, isn't it?
Yeah.
But again, I feel like you can see the difference. Some films are better at covering it up than others, but The Incredible Hulk, Louis Leterrier does not do a very good job of convincing us that downtown Toronto is Harlem. It doesn't work.
Yeah, that's true.
I just want to call out a couple of other features then, as we come through the end of this minute. Then, 2 things I find interesting. One is I just want to say a shout out to Dixie Webster Davis for casting extras, because I think this is possibly the most unsung part of the film business is extras. And all of these recent strikes and negotiations around wages and trying to get contracts that limit the use of AI extracting people's faces from crowds to multiply is all linked to the business of extras casting. And because my understanding is that in the right part of America, you can make a living as an extra. Like you can actually earn a living, a decent wage. You got to hustle, you got to book. But the point is, it can be a job. Like, it's not just I happen to be lucky to turn up and do it while I live there, and then I never did it again. It can be an actual job, and it's those people who the union's been representing, because of course what companies want to do now is just take their likeness and then just have the computer slot them in whenever they need somebody in the crowd or someone in the swimming pool or someone at the football stadium.
And I think there are also knock-on ramifications for doing away with that kind of extras casting, right? Because even if you don't make it big directly because somebody saw you as an extra on something, because honestly, I'm sure it's happened, but it's pretty unlikely. By being in the environment of filming, you learn the ropes, you learn who's who, you learn a lot of things that you're not going to pick up if you're just standing on the sides of a public shoot or something. You get to be in closed sets, you get to see some of the the actual mechanics of the industry, and that gives you the an edge when you then going into audition for other roles, and it provides a pathway for actors into bigger roles, not necessarily huge number, but killing that channel is just gonna kind of keep making this problem of increasing AI usage in cinema. It's just going to perpetuate it, because all of a sudden it's going to be harder to get actors that are really fitting what the director wants or the director's vision, and then all of a sudden, we couldn't find quite the right type of actor, so we're just going to digitally generate them for this film.
Yeah, it's a real problem. So the last thing I wanted to say about this on the credits front is Todd AO. So the sound is credited to the company Todd AO, and Todd AO is absolutely this company is a legend in the history of Hollywood. So they were founded in 1953 by Mike Todd and Robert Nafee, and they were originally one of many companies attempting to develop new widescreen lens and camera formats, because cinema was in a war with television, right? But it was thought that one of the ways to get people back into cinemas was big Technicolor, widescreen, all that sort of thing. And then while they competed with Cinerama and other formats, they didn't really win out. They developed the format for 70mm, but then their co-founder died in an airplane accident. And so they started to move towards audio, and they became an independent sound mixing facility, and they specialized in motion pictures and television. They then acquired Glen Sound, which was also famous in 1986, and that's from then on you see their name on everything, like every TV show I can think of as a kid, right? Like especially all the Stephen J. Cannon ones, so the A-Team, Hardcastle McCormick, all that sort of thing. But like they are just they dominate that entire arena, including sound libraries and so forth and so on. But absolute pillar of the Hollywood community right there. So no surprise that even on an indie production, Cusack goes to them. So very interesting to see their name turn up.
Awesome. Well, Graham, Richard, are you going to join us for our final ever episode? Well, maybe not final ever, but final episode for this film, certainly. And final episode for quite some time, I suspect, considering how exhausted you and I are at the end of this journey. But are you guys going to be back with us tomorrow?
Yeah, I think see this through to the end.
Yeah, make sure that it actually is all over and out the way.
We're still going to have to listen to Dev complaining about editing it for a while.
Well, that's true.
I'm just going to mute Dev in future.
Brilliant.
Well,
absolutely.
This was minute 106 of the Grosse Pointe Blank podcast, Debi Radio 79.5 FM, featuring your hosts, co-writers, and co-producers, myself, Dev Sodiger, and my buddy here who has stuck with me through all of this, Hugh David.
Today's guests were Richard Cottrell and Graham Smith, and you can find us at all good podcast players, as well as on YouTube, X, and Spotify. In all cases, find us at the handle at Debi Radio, DEBI, and also on our website, debiradio.com. Once more, DEBI Radio.
And if you want to talk with us, we do have a Facebook listeners group, Debi Radio 79.5 FM Fan Club. So join us there.
Sure was clear that all of this was new. Concentrating hard like a little girl, smoking for the first time. 'cause I feel